Elizabeth Dackson. I'm a quilter and an author, and I love traditional quilt blocks. Love all different kinds, especially stars, they're my thing. But one of the things I love most about traditional blocks is trying to do something interesting with them. Whether it's putting them in an interesting type of grid setting, putting some interesting colors with them, doing something fresh and different, something interesting. And that's one of the more interesting areas of modern quilting for me, modern traditionalism. It's one of the biggest growing areas of modern quilting, and it's the idea of taking a traditional quilt block that you've seen time and time again and adding something fresh to it, whether it's a fresh color palette, an alternate grid setup, perhaps playing with scale, really just finding something different to do with a traditional quilt block or a traditional quilt layout. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the ways that I've played with modern traditionalism. Like this great example here. This particular quilt is a play on a traditional Sawtooth Star quilt. You'll see that familiar Sawtooth Star quilt shape here in the center of the block in some of my favorite shades of cranberry and aqua. You'll see that there's a really central focus here in the center of the quilt, surrounded by lovely shades of gray. One of the things that's really interesting in particular about this quilt is that it really feels like your eye is drawn into that center of the quilt, and it's almost as though the other parts of the quilt disappear. What you don't tend to notice initially about this particular quilt is that the rest of the quilt is built of Sawtooth Stars as well. All of the surrounding blocks are made of Sawtooth Stars as well. And what I've done is I've recolored some of them to create something of a frame around that central block to really draw your eye in to that center area of the block. That idea of bringing that central focus in to the center part of a quilt, whether it's a large quilt or a small quilt, is one of the things I really like to do in modern traditionalism. Coloring blocks are all, or coloring books I should say, are all the rage these days, and it's one of the most fun ways to play with modern traditionalism is to simply infuse interesting, unexpected uses of color into traditional quilt blocks. The quilt that's hanging back here behind me is another great way that you can experiment with quilt blocks and color in modern traditionalism. You'll see that in the center, well really off center in this particular quilt, that there is a beautiful pink pinwheel set on a bed of white that is quite different from the rest of the quilt. It really doesn't fit with the rest of the quilt and kind of stands out like a bit of, well, a sore thumb. But really, for me, it's the most beautiful part of the quilt because it just screams to you, look at me, look at me, look at me. Now, one of the other ways that you can experiment with modern traditionalism and create that idea of focus within a quilt is with your quilting stitches. You can actually use your quilting stitches to create or enforce that idea of a focal point in a quilt. So for example, in this particular Sawtooth Star quilt that I previously showed you, you'll see that there are different quilting stitches as well as different quilting threads in play. You'll see that there are these loop-de-loop types of patterns that go from left to right throughout the quilt in the background areas. And you'll see that there are also some kind of more jagged lines here in the central block, as well as some more loop-de-loops. But one of the things you'll notice most is the color of threads. The color of threads in those background blocks actually tend to blend in somewhat. You'll notice we've got 3 different shades of gray that we're using. So what I chose for quilting thread there is a variegated thread. I'll be honest, variegated threads, they kind of scare me when it comes to quilting. I tend to be afraid to use them, but when it comes to multicolored backgrounds, they tend to be some of the best colors to use. So if you pick up a variegated thread in your sewing box and think, what on earth am I going to use this for? They're fantastic for multicolored backgrounds because they tend to work best there. They go with so many different things. So what I did is I used that variegated gray throughout in those background colors, so it tends to kind of stand out in some areas and blend in others, and I think it works really well there to really make that background almost whisper throughout the quilt. Whereas in the center of this particular quilt, you'll see I've matched the thread colors. So for example, if I was talking about the gray area, picking a gray thread here would be great. You can actually match the thread color almost to make the stitching stand out even more. It kind of sounds contradictory to pick a matching thread to make something stand out more, but on a solid color especially, it almost makes it look like a printed fabric. It's one of my favorite things about working with solid fabrics actually. But in picking this matching thread color, it really makes this particular part of the design of this particular quilt stand out and make the design sing even more. And you'll see that also throughout these blue and raspberry areas of the quilt as well. So this particular Sawtooth Star quilt, like I said, is really fantastic. And if you look just above the center part of the quilt, you can see that this is just 3x3 Sawtooth Stars. Just right above here, you'll see this is a Sawtooth Star block. Like I said earlier, it almost disappears. So right here's the edge of the bottom. Right here are those side edges. And here's the top. But like I said, it almost disappears because it's those background colors. It's quilted in such a way that it almost kind of whispers in conjunction with the rest of the quilt. Let's take a look at a couple of other examples of modern traditionalism that I happen to have here. I mentioned earlier that color is really the area that I tend to be drawn to when it comes to modern traditionalism. This was one of my earliest examples of modern traditionalism, and one of the things that I like to play with a lot is color, whether it's quilting fabric or quilting stitches, I should say, color, or actual blocks themselves. This is a paper-pieced example. You can do all different kinds of modern traditionalism. You can infuse different colors of fabric with different prints, for example, that are unexpected. This combination of text fabrics with solid colors for me was a really interesting experiment. Trying to keep all of these text fabrics straight and right side up was quite the experiment and quite the challenge at the time. But again, really fun. Modern traditionalism really is about finding something that sings for you. It's a very personal experience. What is really unique to me, I think, about modern traditionalism is finding a way to make a traditional block something that is interesting and really beautiful to you, whether that is color or grid work or finding an interesting way to infuse negative space into a block that doesn't historically or typically have negative space. That's really what it's all about. This last quilt that I want to show you actually has a really interesting story behind it. There's a lot of really deep quilting in this particular quilt, but this particular quilt actually started also very much like the Sawtooth Star quilt that we started with. You'll see that traditional Sawtooth Star shape. But one of the things that I got really interested in not too long ago was arrows. And you'll see that arrow shape repeated over and over again throughout this particular quilt. This quilt is paper-pieced, and one of the things that I was experimenting with at the time is the idea of adding repeating arrows and triangles to a particular block. And you'll see that really repeated throughout this quilt. Not only do you see that, but you also see a good number of spikes throughout this quilt. So this was really the combination of having the star in addition to the arrows and then these spiky shapes. So it's really a very hard quilt. If you think about those hard and soft kind of shapes. A lot of times when you're thinking about quilting stitches, it can be really challenging to think about what on earth am I going to quilt on this quilt. A lot of quilters come to me and say things like, how do you find the perfect quilting stitch? Or how do you figure out how to quilt something? And sometimes there is no perfect quilting stitch for any project. It's really more about what you want that project to look like or what feels like a good stitch to do that day. What are you in the mood for? And the day that I quilted this, I thought to myself, well, with all these points, this needs some opposing views. This needs some softness. So really what I went ahead and did with a good majority of this is I added some softness. I added a lot of curved images. I added a lot of these nice horseshoe types of shapes, or really kind of almost more like infinity shapes. I added some safety pins, just some really nice soft shapes, some curls, that type of thing, to really try to infuse some softness into this quilt so that it didn't feel quite so hard. And in looking at this quilt from just the example that I had drawn on paper versus how it ended up, it's amazing how different the quilting itself made it feel. And again, thinking back to that Sawtooth Star example we looked at initially, I went ahead and chose those matching thread colors again. Going for that contrasting thread would have probably made those quilting stitches look quite a bit different. If you're ever unsure about what kinds of threads to choose for your quilting stitches, take some scraps. I know you have some. We all do. We always have extra fabric lying around our sewing room from our projects. Go ahead and just grab a couple of scraps and experiment. So what we're going to do in just a few minutes later in the episode is we're going to talk about how to take a traditional carpenter star block with a load of half square triangles and infuse some modernity into it. What I've gone ahead and done is taken the carpenter star block and done a bit of a redesign. What we're going to do is we're going to add some scale To the Carpenter Star block, we are going to enlarge the block quite a bit, and we're going to add a really fun border to the block, change the center up a good bit, and we are going to make ourselves a load of half square triangles in a couple of different ways. So come back and join me for that in just a few.